me out. So today we're going to be looking at thinking at genius capacity. Now, this is a little bit of a crazy zone because it goes in the face of a lot of things that we've been taught. Now, where it starts with is we have two basic thinking centers in our brain, and they have completely different there's somebody in the background here. I'm going to have to get them to move. Sorry. You're catching stuff out of the corner of my eye. Kind of an example of the 7 to 10 brain. So the 7 to 10 brain, which is kind of our conscious mind, what it does is it watches things around us and watches for danger or anything that might distract us or might come up against us. And when it does, it shuts off all your deep thinking and focuses on something that's about to happen. So this conscious brain, while it doesn't consider too many things, it's not that smart. It's really acute at seeing anything that's different. And that's really what it was meant to do, is keep us alive. So if you're walking through the jungle and you hear a little bit of a strange noise, your brain goes, oh, what's that? And focuses everything in it because it might be a lion or tiger or wolf or another tribesman coming after you. The other part of our brain considers really deep things. So that conscious brain that looks out for danger, it can consider about 7 things at its max. The other part of our brain, that deep thinking brain, can consider almost infinite things simultaneously. Now, some people say that it can consider 2,000 things. Some say 5,000. Some say up to 50,000. New estimates are coming back that our deep thinking brain can actually consider up to 2 million gigabytes of data, which is just incredible, right? It's far surpasses anything that modern computation can do. And so in every one of us, we've got these two thinking centers. There's one that can consider 7 to 10 things, and then it makes an assumption. And then the other one can consider tens of thousands of things and come up with seriously high-level thought. Now, what determines whether you're a high-level thinker or not is which part of the brain you spend most of your time in. So let's go over a couple more functions of them so you can start to understand which part of the brain you're in. So that 7 to 10 brain, you'll see a picture of it in your workbook. I'm not sure if you got a chance to download this, but that little 7 to 10 brain, the smaller part of our brain, and then we've got the giant part that can do 50,000. So when you're in that 7 to 10 brain, what makes it great is it takes very little effort to do things. So instead of having to do deep computations for maybe driving to work, you can run it almost on autopilot because that 7 to 10 brain kind of looks at the situation, puts you on autopilot, and lets you cruise. So an example of it might be your morning commute into work. So you're coming down the freeway and there's clear sailing. There's not one car on the road. That 7 to 10 brain can just put you on autopilot and you can drive all the way to wherever you work without even thinking about it, right? You can kind of space out and maybe be missing 15 minutes because you're just on complete autopilot. But on the other hand, where your deep thinking brain might come up is when you get into traffic and you've got multiple different routes and you're trying to co-consider, okay, well, there's a school there and it's going to be clogged with people dropping off their kids for school. There's this over here and it's not going to work. Or, once you start to really engage your problem solving in traffic, that's when your deep brain starts to work. So how do you know when you're in your deep brain or when you're in your stupid brain? Here's a few key things for you to consider and practice. Now, the first one is, are there words in your head? Now, most of you are probably too young to remember Magnum PI. But I remember Magnum PI, he'd be riding in his red Ferrari, and he'd be driving down the road, and he'd be talking about, well, Robin lent me this Ferrari, and he'd be kind of talking in his head. Anytime you have your internal monologue rolling, you're in your stupid brain. Your deep thinking, co-considering brain, that 50,000 brain, doesn't have a verbal outlet. It only thinks in meaning and in visions and pictures. So if you're talking something through and the words are in your head, you're only using the small part of your brain, not the really big part of your brain. The next thing that you can think about is how fast you're coming to conclusions. So your small brain, that 7 to 10 brain, it can process information very quickly, 5/8 of a second to a second. So you see something and, oh, you got it. Maybe you're in a conversation and halfway through somebody's sentence, you start thinking about what you're going to say. That's your stupid brain, because it can respond in under a second. Now, your deep thinking brain, it processes way more information, and to do that, it takes more time. So if somebody asks you a question and you go into your deep 50K brain to answer it, it takes 3 to 5 seconds for your brain to scan all of your memories, all of your thoughts, and come up with a high-level response. So if you're in a conversation, you're working with your team, you're asking questions, and people are responding, and after a second, maybe you're partway through asking the question and somebody's got their hand up, they're not going to give you a high-level response. That's an assumption response coming out of that stupid part of their brain. On the other hand, if you can listen to people deeply, after they ask you a question, wait 1, 2, 3 before coming up to a response, you can be giving answers that are from that deepest part of the brain. The next thing is, are you present? Now, being present is kind of especially a lot of you are from California, it's a bit of a woo-woo thing in California, people loving to be present. But what it really means is, are you in the moment that you're in and not worried about the past or the future? So that 7 to 10 brain, its main job is to keep you alive. It's to look for danger anywhere, and that's its main job. So here's the thing. If you're in a spot where you're not in immediate danger, that 7 to 10 brain starts to feel really irrelevant. And what it starts to do is ask itself, well, is there anything that was dangerous from yesterday? Is there anything I should worry about for tomorrow? Is there anything about the next week? If you have nothing to worry about in a week, maybe there's something to worry about in 2 weeks. And so if you're just having a beautiful Saturday morning, something like this, and all of a sudden you start worrying about something you said yesterday, you start being concerned about something that could happen on Monday, you're not in your deep thinking brain. That obsessive worrying and anxiety only comes from our small brain, that assumptive brain that's using only a fraction of our brain's computation power. So if you're ever worried about something that's not happening right in the moment, that means you're in the wrong part of your brain when you're thinking for problem solving. Next one is kind of a cool one. This is one of my favorites. For those of you who've worked with me in person, you kind of know this is something I'm always doing. The small brain, that 7 to 10 brain, uses very little mental energy because it's only processing a couple of points and then making an assumption. That 50K brain, the big brain, when it engages, it starts to use mass amounts of blood sugar. Up to 50% of your body's blood sugar can be pushed in to fuel your brain when it's really in a deep thinking mode. When that cognitive strain hits, when the mental load of all that thinking hits, your pupils dilate. You have a physiological response and your pupils dilate and get bigger. So if you're working on a problem or you're trying to figure something out and you wonder what part of your brain you're in, if you have your phone handy, snap a quick selfie. Maybe if you have your friend or spouse or somebody beside you, go, hey, take a look at my pupils. What do you see? Right? And if your pupils are completely dilated, you're actually processing stuff in your deep thinking brain. For all the medics out there, they're probably thinking, well, either that or they're on drugs. Well, let's just assume that you're not on drugs while you're trying to do some deep thinking. So that obviously screws with this whole thing. But for the most part, if you're not on drugs and your pupils are dilated, it's the mental load of deep thinking that's stretching them out. Yeah, that's right, Adam. I'm not high. I'm just thinking deep. That's all. So watch for your pupils popping. Phone, mirror, friends, kind of keep an eye on it and see where it's going. Now, what's also really cool is when you're explaining something to somebody, particularly something important, if you explain it one way and you see their pupils are still small, you re-explain it a different way, their pupils are still small. And finally, when they have that aha moment where they go, you'll watch their pupils pop and you know they're in their deep brain. Another thing you can do is watch for speaking in absolutes. So if you say to yourself, well, they never do this, or that person always does this. If you're using absolutes like never, always, and you feel really confident in those, you're in your stupid brain. Because anytime you're deeply considering a human, you're not going to say, well, they always do that. Well, of course they don't always do it. Maybe the majority of the time. So anytime you're speaking in absolutes or somebody else is speaking in absolutes, you're in your idiot brain. So there's just a few of the basics on how you can know what part of the brain you're thinking in. Any questions on this? Let's maybe go to some of the text that you have here and kind of break down any questions that you might have based on what sort of brain capacity you have and what state you're in. I'll give you a second, 3 seconds to come up with it. No questions? Excellent point, Jared. They absolutely do. And for the most part, the 7 to 10 brain wins out. It's also kind of known in some circles as the ego, and the ego is egotistical. It wants to be relevant. And so that's when it really pushes on anxiety. So if you're sitting in a safe place, you're hanging out at home, you're just enjoying a moment and there's nothing wrong, that ego, that 7 to 10 part of the brain wants to be relevant. And so what it does is it forces you to worry about something. It forces you to worry about something from the past or the future so that it can be relevant again. And what's really crappy about this is that normally the times when we experience the greatest anxiety is in moments where we can't do anything about the problem. It's not happening to us at the moment, and we should be recovering. It's in those moments when we get home at night, where we're relaxed, or you wake up in the middle of the night. There's absolutely no danger. There's no problem. And yet that 7 to 10 brain, that ego, wants desperately to be relevant. And so it starts to kind of make up problems and rehearse old problems so it can take over and be relevant again. But that is exactly the thing, Jared. For the most part, the 7 to 10 brain is the only one that competes for space, and it gets it. Trying to drive a point in meeting to have the person remember, what was you said you need to dilate pupils? So what it is your brain has that 7 to 10 brain. It also kind of it determines how much mental energy is released. So it's kind of like the goalie to deep thinking brain. So in just about all conversations and just about all presentations, you start off with everybody in their 7 to 10 brain. And it's a little bit like a combination lock on a safe. What you have to do is you have to hit the exact right points for that 7 to 10 brain to think the information is relevant enough to open up the deep thinking brain. So what you're trying to do when you speak to somebody is look them in the eye, try and figure out how your information would be most applicable to them, and then mention a point. And it's kind of like when you explain it one way, it's like 17 to the right. They didn't quite get it. You go back 23 to the left, and you think, okay, maybe they're getting a little bit more. And you keep re-explaining it in different angles. And the second they actually engage and get what you're saying, what you'll get from them is you'll see like their shoulders move, you'll see their pupils dilate. The second that you get past the gatekeeper and you get into their deep brain, instantly their pupils dilate, and then they'll start to explain things back to you in their own terms. So what you're looking for to know if the person you're talking to is went into their deep brain is you're watching for their pupils to pop, and you're watching for them to give you experiences from their own life that relate to what you just said. So those are the main things you're looking at. I have no clue, Adam, on the on the drug side. I have zero drug experience. If I did, my mom would kill me. If I was around people who did drugs or I did drugs, my mom would kill me dead. So I have no experience in that at all. Any really? Yeah, definitely. It's different for everybody, but for the most part, that's totally true, Lori. People, they kind of go up when they're going somewhere for deep thinking. But statistically, people who watch for that cue are more wrong than right. So it's a really dangerous thing to try and read in people. Micro expressions, it's really just in a regular conversation, it's pretty tough to pull those out. So kind of going with the watching for people explaining things from their long-term memory, their pupils dilating, and just the physiological response that they're actually getting what you're saying. Back to kind of watching it for yourself too. If you're talking to somebody and you're trying to get yourself into a deep thinking state when you're talking to somebody else, as they're explaining things to you, try and think of examples from your own experience that relate to that. And what's interesting is your 7 to 10 brain doesn't have access to your long-term memory. It can only process things that have happened in your short-term memory. So if somebody's explaining something to you and you try and think of an instance where it was real in your own life more than a few days ago, you go back to a call you ran 2 years ago, a hospital you went into, a project you were working on, and if you try and relate what somebody's saying to something that happened to you 2-3 years ago and find a specific instance for it, that'll draw your mind into thinking from that deep brain in order to access your long-term memory. Any other questions on that? One thing that we don't want to do is trash on the 7 to 10 brain too much, because it really does a lot of good for us in our lives. If you were to walk around all day thinking in your deep brain, you would burn mass amounts of blood sugar, mass amounts of energy, and you'd be tired and depressed all the time. So it's not that we want to walk around in that part of our brain all the time. There's a reason there's like that thin line between genius and insanity, and we want to stay well on the genius side of it. So the main thing that we want to do is get into that deep thinking brain at key moments when it's needed, and then rest and recover in our 7 to 10 brain anytime we don't have to be deeply engaged. So for instance, all of our things that we do kind of automatically, like maybe riding a bike, if you're Canadian, ice skating, things that were very difficult at first and they kind of run on autopilot now, that's in that 7 to 10 part of the brain. So there's all kinds of really complex things you do in your life, paperwork, the way you use technology, and you can kind of do it on autopilot. That's all that 7 to 10 brain. So while it's really not that hot for problem solving, it's really good at saving energy throughout the day. The more you're on autopilot, the more energy you save for the times when you really need to be thinking deeply. Particularly for you in medicine, things like the way you do compressions, the bleed control training that I know a lot of you do, having those things so they're hardwired so that the person just goes into their 7 to 10 brain, they don't even have to think about it. They can just act. Those are excellent things. And really the core for, I think, a lot of the training that you do clinically as a medic. Any other thoughts on that, folks? Okay, so what we want you to be able to do for the next month, and there's going to be little video tips that are going to be coming out every week, but we want you to start to recognize when you're in your deep thinking genius brain and when you're in your assumption stupid thinking brain. The more you can do that, and the more you can time your brilliant states to when you're doing the hardest cognitive work. So those times where you really need to be brilliant, you're collaborating with people, you're building long-term strategic plans for your unit, you're doing all of those things, making sure that you know how to get in a genius state when you're doing those important things. Again, the big things that we want you to look for as you go through this month is, are there words in your head? Practice at regular intervals, observing things around you and listening to people without having any words in your head. Anytime you can get the words out of your head and just be absorbed in what somebody's saying, visualizing it, kind of trying to understand what they mean, you're going to be in that 50K brain. Making sure you're present. Now, again, what does that mean? That you're not, when you're in a meeting, when you're with a patient, when you're with somebody that you're in a relationship with, that you're not thinking about tomorrow, you're not thinking about what you're going to do after, you're not thinking about some conversation or something that happened before, but you're 100% in that moment and only considering things from that moment, you'll be in that deep thinking brain. And again, if at all possible, looking to see if your pupils are dilated. Now, on the converse of this, if you're speaking to people and they're speaking in absolutes, you never, you always, they're not bringing up things relevant to the conversation, they're bringing up stuff from the past or the future that aren't really connected, they're trying to dump anxieties on you or anything like that, understand you're not speaking to the best version of that person, you're speaking to that assumptive croc brain, and you're really not going to get through to them that much. So the main points on these is for the next month, and there's going to be some basic videos coming out to help you along the way. But try and make sure you understand the difference between your assumptive brain, that dumb brain, and your brilliant brain that allows you to think in genius states. If you can start to sort that out, it'll give you a huge advantage in your life. It'll cut down your worrying, and it'll increase your problem-solving capacity geometrically. So we got about 5 minutes left in the time. We don't have to use it. If you have no more questions, we'll call it right there. But any other questions you have, just put them in the type box there and we'll give a minute for that. Perfect. No questions. If you have time and you have Facebook on one form or another, please find some time to join us, because a lot of the application and what's coming out from the videos and that we're putting in that group, if you don't have Facebook, it doesn't mean you can't just download it. Don't find any friends. You don't have to like immerse yourself in the Facebook world to just download the app and join the group. And even if that's all you do, we would love to have you join us. Lori. Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the things that we really want to work with the folks from the NHL to be able to hardwire those skills in, because the way that stuff works is all of the information you collect during your day. So say you go on a BLS course and you're learning your CPR, all the things that you learn, when you go to sleep, they get all of the packets of information that you learn get combined into your beliefs and your assumptions that you will do tomorrow. So perfect example, right, Jared? So I'm trying to explain Lori's thing. I saw your message come in, totally got me completely out of my deep brain, and now I'm sitting here in my 7 to 10 brain taking a second to get back. That's exactly what happens. So for Lori, just to finish up, so if you're able to train people things in a way that's meaningful, that's action-based, and they sleep on it, and they train again action-based, sleep on it, every time they sleep on it, that assumption auto response gets stronger and stronger and stronger in their skills, and the less energy they'll need to put toward it. And so for all of you who are in training, the more consistent the training is and the more action-based it is, the more it'll become second nature for people, and they won't have to think so hard to perform skills properly. And Jared, you're absolutely right. The 7 to 10 brain's job is to look for distractions, and the second it sees a distraction, it shuts off the deep thinking brain and focuses on the distraction. So every email ping, every siren, every person walking by, every person yelling at somebody in the next room, everything that happens like that takes you out of that state almost instantly. It's one of the reasons why environment is so insanely important for deep thinking, because it's just going to take you right out instantly. And society-wise, it's just about impossible to get a few moments of silence as a leader to be able to think deeply, particularly in a role like yours. I don't know the last time you would have had maybe a solid half hour to 45 minutes at work without something interrupting. Anything else? Obviously, you can message me after or email, and I can answer anything offline as well. Okay. Well, we're kind of coming up on the half hour anyway, so let's call it there. Anything you have, any questions you have, Lori's always around, and I'm always around, and anything we can do to help, we'll be there for you. Have yourself a great weekend, folks. Bye.